College football nerds here talking Florida State Seminoles. Got my sidekick Josh here. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We didn't do a lot of Florida State last year. We did do the Boise State game. And then you didn't have the best season, so unfortunately we didn't get to talk a whole lot. But go ahead, beat the rush. We're going to be talking about you more this year. Like, subscribe, helps us out. Homework for you watching the video right now in the comments. Give us your prediction for Florida State this season. Go ahead and just give us a number and we'll engage you there. Josh, let's get into it really quick. Last year and the year before, you were vocal about how much you did not love Willie Taggart. And it was clear to everybody. You made everybody know it. And I was actually higher than you were on Willie Taggart, but you were proven right in this instance. And this year, both of us are higher on Florida State than a lot of people are nationally. A lot of that has to do with your pessimism on Taggart feeding into some optimism now that he's gone. So why don't you get into that a little bit real quick, talk about why you weren't high on Taggart and kind of how that opens up some possibilities with Norvell.
I wasn't high on Taggart just due to his experience level. I had watched him at previous stops. I'd seen interviews with him, I'm a football nerd, okay? So I watched like coaching clinic videos and stuff I can find. Frankly, I hadn't been wholly impressed with Taggart, with where he was. I'll say I wasn't that high on PJ Fleck either. Maybe I'm being proven wrong on that. I'm not sure. I think he's a good motivator, but Taggart in many ways was, similarly inexperienced. And going into the Florida State sort of season, looking at what was going on with where the roster was coming out of Fisher, Florida State needed someone that had a lot of structure. They needed somebody that had the organizational skills to rebuild it. And with Taggart, my main thing is that Taggart had never been a coordinator at the Power 5 level. He went from Western Kentucky, where he spent several years under, he's like the adopted brother of Harbaugh's, which most Florida State fans are probably aware of. And then he was a running back coach for a couple years at Stanford, and then bang, immediately was the head coach at Western Kentucky and then South Florida. Had mostly bad years at those schools, had a couple goodish years, enough to get him the South Florida job once, and then, of course, he had the one really good year at South Florida. But then he goes to Oregon for 1 year and then Florida State. So you've got a guy that is a coordinator or a Power 5 coach, or a coordinator or a head coach, had only been in a Power 5 program 1 year. It was his head coach year at Oregon. He had never been a coordinator at the Power 5 level. He'd only been a co-coordinator for 1 year at Western Kentucky. Never been a standalone offensive coordinator. He'd gone directly to the head coaching job. So from 2010 on, that was his total experience as a coordinator or a head coach. Now, what I'll say before I flip it back to you is when you look at Mike Norvell, people look at him as a young and experienced coach, but I think something you have to realize, he was at Pitt as the offensive coordinator in 2011. He's been in the Power 5 from 2011 through 2015. He actually has more Power 5 experience as a coordinator or a head coach than Taggart does. He has been a coordinator or a head coach for the same amount of time. Both have been 10 years. And Norvell came out of Graham, who, built up Gus Malzahn at Tulsa. I talk about that a lot, that people miss that connection. There's a lot for me with Norvell what risks he had are, less, especially than when Taggart was hired. And at this point, Norvell is really as experienced today as Taggart is today as a coordinator or Power 5 coach. Only Norvell actually has more experience in a Power 5 program than Taggart does. And that's one of the big encouraging things to me with the hire of Mike Norvell compared to especially where they were coming in with a guy that had only spent 2 years at a Power 5 program with Willie Taggart.
And so if it's fair to say that we're going to have improvements on the coaching staff, which I think is pretty easy to see, it's encouraging to me. We just finished talking about LSU and Michigan, and they were kind of diametrically opposed in that sometimes we like for you to be a top team that doesn't have a lot of draft picks. And it sounds counterintuitive, but if you just go ham on the draft like LSU did, that means you lost a lot of really elite production. Michigan didn't really have that. So there's a little bit of encouragement. They've got guys coming back that are seasoned veterans that can produce, and that maybe just didn't get the visibility because they weren't on a good football team or a top football team. Florida State lost one guy, Cam Akers. That's it. So coaching staff comes in with a lot of guys that have got a lot of snaps under their belt, and there's a lot of room for optimism here because you might have, like we say with 2017 Georgia, a ton of players who were artificially on that team that were artificially senior, in that you have producing redshirt juniors and seniors that would have gone in a draft had that team been higher profile under the spotlight the year before, but they weren't, so they stayed another year, and I think that's what we got a lot with Florida State. They've got some good transfers coming in. I want you to touch on this a little bit, and I hate doing this. I hate when fans do this, but we're not Florida State fans, so we can do this. It's fair. Maybe it's not fair. Let me know. Florida went 6-7 last year, lost a close game to Arizona State. In just the regular season, they're 3 scores away from winning 9 games. So I don't want to even talk about that they lost a 1-score game to Arizona State because they would have been going to a better bowl. But we think about how bad Florida State was because we hold them to Florida State's standard of 10 wins or bust, at least. But 1-score game against Boise where they blew a huge lead. 22-20 to Wake. Wake wasn't a terrible team last year. 31-24 to Virginia, who's actually a really good team last year. So is this another thing that we can look to say, okay, under the surface, there's a lot of markers that say this team can be a lot better? Or is it going back to the year before and saying, hey, if you add a score here, you add a score there, you could have won 9 games, and that's kind of stupid? Because we've said that people who do that sometimes are being stupid.
I think the biggest trap is when you start making those distinctions in a team that also, let's say, won 6 games by a touchdown or less. And we see that a lot, right? Like, oh, if we just, we score 7 points more in these 3 games, we'll win 9 games. Like, yeah. And I think Minnesota was a culprit last year. You also had, and Oklahoma was another one, right? You lose these close games, but you also won a bunch of games by narrow margins that you had no business winning. Florida State's a little different. I mean, their wins were pretty decisive. Louisville was double digits. NC State's double digits. Boston College, it was a 1-score game late in the year, but Alabama State, big whoop. I think there's the scary thing with ULM in week 2. But Florida State kind of looked like a team that was just not quite as good as the other teams that were pretty good. And that was from a team that had to go to overtime with Louisiana Monroe. I think it's fair to say that Florida State kind of found a way to lose games that they probably should have been able to win if they were a better coached and better put together football team. When you look at their depth chart and they return 7 offensive starters, 10 defensive starters, those numbers are always kind of screwy because you got guys like, DJ Matthews that play a lot of snaps, and maybe you count him, maybe you don't. There's a tremendous amount of potential for them to be at least as good as they were last year. If the coaching improves, then, maybe you score an extra point, a touchdown in those games. Maybe your team doesn't quit on the coach at the end of the season and you drop like a game against Wake Forest that you were more than capable of winning, or you have a dud against Miami. And then you get players that come in, they get healthier. Maybe a guy like Kendo can produce a lot for your football team. And then all of a sudden now, like you said, it easily could go from 6 wins to 9 wins. And I'm not sure what, the reasonable expectation is, but given where the ACC frankly is as a conference, there's a tremendous amount of potential to be a 9 or 10 win team without a whole lot of changes. The West Virginia opener is not the easiest thing in the world by any means. That West Virginia is kind of a program in transition. You play at Boise State in week 3, not an easy schedule. You still got to play Clemson. You still got to play at Miami. You still got to play Florida. The toughest thing if you're Florida State is the schedule, but I do think they could be substantially improved. And in my mind, I think Clemson's probably a bridge too far, but is it out of the realm of possibility for them to go like 10-2 or 9-3? Absolutely not. I mean, they could lose to Clemson. They could lose to Florida, who I think will be probably a top 10 team this year. They're probably one of the better rosters they've had in a while. Maybe you drop one out of like West Virginia, Boise State, and say, I mean, I have no idea, but like Miami. And then you're 9-3. And that's going to be a really good season given the difficulty. that you have, and maybe you run the table in the rest of the ACC and you end up 10-2. You know, you're in a bad situation in terms of having good quality opponents, but we talk about this a lot. You want top 15 opponents. You want teams like 15 through 25 on your schedule so you can have ranked wins. You don't really want to play top 15 teams because it's hard to beat them and it's easy to get losses. Florida State's going to be in the position to get a lot of ranked wins. You know, you could go 10-2, lose to the only top 10 teams you play, and get a couple ranked wins on your belt without a whole lot of difficulty, and be a team that's really 15th through 20th in terms of overall quality. That would be a huge stepping stone if you're Florida State, given the past few years, and I think it's realistic given where the roster is.
I think we also got to give Florida State a little bit of scheduling credit, because there's a lot of teams out there that they take their 9, because it's usually 9 conference game teams, like from the Pac-12, Big 12, Big 10. They'll take their 9 conference games and then add a Boise and say that's just as good as a Power 5, which I don't agree with, but I will say that that's a serious G5, right? So we've got Florida State, who plays Florida every year. So they've already got the 8-game conference schedule, and they play Florida every year. So that's 9. They're adding West Virginia, which they don't even have to. And they're playing not just Boise, they're playing a home and home. So they're playing at Boise. Like, that to me, like, that deserves a ton of credit. And so that's my follow-up before we get into predictions. You touched on the schedule. I do think the schedule is hard. Is it very possible that Florida State could be a tremendously improved team this year, but it not necessarily show up in the wins and losses because their schedule is so much tougher than last year?
Absolutely. I mean, an 8-4 Florida State would probably have to be a lot better than last year's 7-5 squad. The Florida State team that we saw at the beginning of last season, they're going to be in the same boat starting the year. Starting the year 1-2, beating Stanford. But then when you go through the rest of the season, looking at like Clemson, you look at Florida, you really have no hope of being any better than 8-4, and you're probably going to drop, the Miamis and the whatnot, and you're gonna end up something like 6-6 or 6-7. So I think the hardest thing to get across too is just it's hard to avoid 3 or 4 losses in this schedule. You're gonna have to be a pretty good team to be a 3-loss team. A 4-loss team is still going to require you to be a good football team this year. I think it's viable for Florida State to be 8 or even 9 wins. I really do. It would not shock me if they're like Miami a few years ago and they're flirting with like the top 10, with 1 loss to Clemson going into the Florida game. Wouldn't shock me one iota. And yeah, I'll all the credit in the world to Florida State. You can talk a lot about whether the schedule is worth a lot or not, or whether it just hurts you to schedule tough teams. I do think, for what it's worth, the playoff committee is very aware of the difficulty of scheduling schedules like this, and they give a lot of credit to it. So I think this is probably, personally, I'm going to say they're like an 8 or 9 win team. Maybe even, I could be bold and say 9 wins, but probably 8 is more realistic. But an 8-win team, maybe a 2-win improvement over last year's 6-7 team, but it's a significant increase in quality to get to that point.
Why don't you go ahead and give me your prediction that we'll point to at the end of the year? Give me your prediction for them this year, instead of saying what you really kind of maybe they do. Tell me what you think they'll do.
So I wasn't planning to do this, and he's putting me on the spot. I'm gonna go out on a limb, and I'm gonna say 9-3. Like I have a lot of faith in Florida State. I think they're set up to do very well this year. I may eat crow. That offensive line was terrible. Like we said, they get bringing in some transfers and things to try to shore it up. So I'm assuming a little bit changes, but just having a defense that plays well on a daily basis is going to make them easily one of the better defensive units in the ACC and put them ahead of the curve in that regard. You've got an experienced quarterback in Blackman that, he hasn't always been great, but he's actually a pretty talented guy, and he's had some great games at times. And I think the potential is absolutely there. And then you got guys like, the Terror Terry that can like turnover a game. I mean, you've got real athletes. Marvin Wilson, Asante Samuel, top shelf players on both sides of the ball. A little interesting to see what happens at running back, but you've got several options. I think they're in a really good position to be an 8 or 9 win team. I'm going to go ahead and make a 9-3 prediction.
I don't think that's ridiculous. The thing that I love about it is nobody's making that prediction right now, except maybe Florida State fans. I'm gonna say 8-4. To me, when you look at a schedule, you try to pick out games like where's the game they're going to lose that they're not supposed to lose, and where's the game they're going to win that they're not supposed to win. The problem is there's only 2 games on their schedule that they're not supposed to win like at all, and that's to me Florida and Clemson. And I think those 2 teams are just too far ahead of Florida State right now to reasonably say, oh, well, they could pop up and win this one and lose this one. So out of the gate, we're starting it at best 10-2 as their ceiling. But then I think West Virginia, then you get a breather with Samford, and then at Boise State, at In-State versus Clemson to start the season. That's tough. So I think you're probably going to lose one of those games before you get to Clemson. So then you're saying you've got to run the table with all of your other games to go 9-3, and that's a little tough for me. I'm going to say 8-4. I would not be shocked at 9-3. I wouldn't be shocked at 7-5, but kind of like I said earlier, I could totally see a 7-5 Florida State game. And we've seen this in the past. You talk about bowl draws. We've seen this in the past where a team is 7-5 with a tough schedule, and they just rake somebody in the bowl game. I think we saw this a couple years ago with Texas A&M versus NC State, where Texas A&M had a brutal schedule in the SEC, played Clemson out of conference, and then they were 7-5 or something like that, and won like 56-14. I think I could see that if Florida State doesn't have the 8-4, 9-3 type of year that maybe the fans want, I could see them really having a good end of the year with whatever bowl draw they get. So that's going to be it for us on Florida State, but we promise to do more Florida State content this year, especially if they prove out to be what we say or think they're going to be. We want to take our victory lap, and we'll do that with y'all with a new video. So remember, in the comments, give us your prediction for the season for Florida State. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.